It began, as these things often do, with a woman screaming in the fog. The lamplighter on Wexley Street had just finished his rounds when he heard it, raw, terrified, and suddenly cut short. No one believed him at first. London was noisy, and screams weren't rare. But the next morning, the body of Eleanor Wren, a respected botanist, was found in her study, eyes wide, mouth open, her fingernails torn and bloodied, as if she'd tried to claw her own thoughts out. No signs of forced entry, no wounds, only a note. I thought I could trust him. I thought therapy would help. But now, he lives inside my mind. The file landed on Inspector Thorne Whitlock's desk 3 hours later. A man known for cold logic, Thorne rarely blinked, not even at death scenes. But something in Eleanor's frozen expression unsettled him. Not fear, not pain, something deeper, like recognition. This wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Because somewhere in the quiet corners of the city, someone had learned not just how to kill the body, but how to rewire the mind. And no one knew his name. This is not just a murder story. This is a story about power, control, and the terrifying intimacy of the human mind. Welcome to the case that shattered Inspector Thorne's reality and led him to a man who didn't want to be a killer. He wanted to be a god of the mind. The rain had not stopped since Eleanor Wren's death. Inspector Thorne Whitlock stood outside Ravenshade Asylum, the iron gates groaning as they opened. The warden had summoned him about a patient brought in 2 nights ago, a young woman found wandering near the Thames, soaked, barefoot, and whispering the same word over and over again. Hollow, hollow, hollow. She had no name, no papers, and no recollection of her past, but her wrists bore thin bruises, symmetrical, almost surgical, and her pupils remained unnaturally dilated, as though staring into something no one else could see. Dr. Halberd, the asylum's head physician, greeted Thorne with a tense nod. She's not violent, he explained, but something's missing. It's as though someone reached in and carved away parts of her memory. Inside her cell, the girl sat calmly on the bed, tracing invisible lines on the wall. When she turned her head toward Thorne, her voice was barely audible. He taught me how to forget, then made me remember what wasn't real. Thorne felt something twist in his gut. He showed her a photo of Eleanor Wren. Nothing. Then a name. Dr. Alaric Vale, a suspected psychologist once mentioned in another patient file. Her eyes widened. She began to shiver. "Don't say that name," she whispered. "It echoes." Dr. Halberd later confirmed the name had been linked to several high society women seeking experimental therapy, most of whom were now dead, missing, or institutionalized. But no records of Dr. Vale existed in London's medical registry. No address, no license, no face, just stories and whispers. Inspector Whitlock left Ravenshade shaken. Whoever this man was, he didn't just erase memories. He replaced them. 2 nights later, Thorne sat in his study, rain drumming against the windows like restless fingers. Files surrounded him, pages filled with cryptic notes, strange symbols, and the same recurring name. Dr. Alaric Vale. But it wasn't the files that disturbed him. It was the journal. It had arrived without a sender, wrapped in oilskin and placed on his doorstep. The cover was old leather, cracked and warped by time. Inside were pages filled with chaotic handwriting and frantic sketches. Thorne recognized the penmanship. Eleanor Wren's. He made me see things that were never there, then made me forget things that were. Her last entries became erratic, looping the same phrases. The mirror doesn't lie. The mirror smiles when I don't. He lives behind the reflection. Thorne frowned and glanced toward the tall mirror in his study, a Victorian heirloom inherited from his father. For a long moment, it seemed perfectly still. Then he noticed it. His reflection didn't blink when he did. He froze. It was subtle, a fraction of a second out of sync, but enough to send a jolt down his spine. He stepped closer, inspecting the glass. Nothing, just his tired eyes, pale skin, and the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. Until it smiled. Not him, the reflection. A flicker, gone in an instant. Was it lack of sleep? A trick of the light? Thorne wasn't sure anymore. He slammed the journal shut and pulled his coat on. There was only one place that might hold answers now. The old university where Eleanor had studied psychology. If Vale had ever taught, officially or in whispers, it would be there. As he left, the mirror stood silent. But behind the glass, something remained, and it was learning. The corridors of Old Belgrave University were silent, abandoned for nearly a decade after the fire in the East Wing. Dust hung thick in the air, and the walls bore scorch marks like old battle scars. Few dared enter the charred psychology department, but Inspector Thorne Whitlock wasn't here for comfort. He was looking for ghosts, specifically Dr. Alaric Vale's. According to Eleanor's journal, Vale once gave private lectures in room 42B, a soundproofed basement hall with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. The kind used for containment, not learning. The door resisted at first, but with a firm push, it creaked open. Inside, the lecture room remained mostly intact. Rows of seats, a scorched podium, and something odd at the front wall, a two-way mirror, its reflective surface now cracked, as if something had tried to claw its way through. On the desk lay a wax cylinder recorder, dusty, ancient, but intact. Thorne wound it up, the cylinder whirred, then hissed. A voice emerged, deep, calm, methodical. This is session 12. Subject has begun to reject false implants. Amnesia walls are cracking. Induced fear remains effective. We proceed. A pause. Then a faint scream in the background, female, muffled, followed by the voice again. Fear is not an emotion. It is a gateway. The recording cut out. Thorne stood frozen. The voice had no accent, no inflection, like a man who had rehearsed being human. And the scream, it matched audio from an old case file, patient number 27. Also found whispering, hollow. Suddenly, a breeze passed behind him, though there were no windows, no vents, just a sensation, cold, breathless. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Yet something had moved. The mirror bore fresh condensation, as though someone had just exhaled behind it. He stepped closer. A handprint. From the inside, Inspector Thorne left the university shaken. The voice on the recording still echoed in his mind. Cold, unnatural. There was something deeply wrong about it, as if the speaker didn't just study the human mind, but reshaped it at will. But who was Dr. Alaric Vale? According to official records, no such man ever existed. Thorne scoured old registries, alumni logs, faculty lists. Nothing. No birth certificate, no published papers, no grave, just second-hand stories and whispered fears among the university's oldest staff. Only one lead remained, Cecil Vale, a retired clockmaker rumored to be Alaric's brother. He lived alone in a crumbling cottage outside Whitechapel, where fog covered the streets like mourning veils. Thorne found the old man staring blankly from a rocking chair, surrounded by broken timepieces. "You're not the first to ask about him," Cecil rasped, eyes never leaving the dark corner of the room. "But you'll be the last." Thorne pressed on. "Who was he?" Cecil didn't answer at first, just reached for a faded photograph. 2 boys, identical twins. One smiling, one not. "He wasn't born," Cecil finally said. He was left behind. Left behind? Cecil nodded slowly. Our mother said he came back wrong. After the fever, he stopped crying, stopped blinking, watched her sleep at night, smiled when father died. He didn't speak for a year, and when he did, it wasn't in a voice we recognized. A chill crept into the room. He said things before they happened, whispered thoughts that weren't mine, and when we locked him in the attic, he said, "I'll come back through your eyes." Thorne felt his breath catch. What happened to him? Cecil turned slowly to Thorne, eyes wide with fear. I don't know, but the mirror in the attic still fogs up, even though no one lives up there. Thorne stood, heart racing. He had to see it for himself. The stairs to the attic creaked under Inspector Thorne's weight, groaning like an old man warning him to turn back. Dust danced in the shafts of his lantern light. The house itself felt alert, as if it had been holding its breath for decades, and now, finally, someone was coming back. He reached the attic door, padlocked, 3 times. Cecil hadn't lied. Thorne broke the rusted chains with a crowbar and slowly pushed the door open. The air was stale, thick, unmoving, like the room had been vacuum-sealed from time. But what hit him harder than the stench was the sound. A low whispering, faint, unintelligible, like multiple voices talking just below hearing range. The room was otherwise empty, save for one thing, a full-length mirror. Tall, cracked, familiar. It was identical to the one he saw in Vale's lecture room, but this one had something written across it in chalk. Not me, not me, not me. Over and over again, like a mantra written by someone desperate to separate themselves from something. Thorne stepped closer and saw it. In the corner, behind a pile of moth-eaten blankets, a leather-bound journal. The name on the cover, Alaric Vale. But every word inside was written in reverse, a mirror diary. He held it up to the glass and read the first line, I am not a man, I am a window. Page after page detailed experiments not with chemicals or psychology, but with thought transference, empathy manipulation, and something labeled mirror breach points. Then came a list of subjects, 27 names, all redacted, except one, Eleanor Harrow, the same Eleanor whose case had started all of this, the one who said the word hollow. Thorne stepped back from the mirror, heart pounding, and for a moment in the reflection his mouth kept moving. Even after he'd stopped speaking, Thorne didn't sleep that night. He didn't even leave the house. Instead, he sat downstairs with Cecil Vale, the journal resting in his lap, the attic door creaking gently above them, though no wind moved. I need to know everything, Thorne said, his voice tight with fatigue and fear. Who was Eleanor Harrow to him? Cecil stared into his cold tea. She was the first. The first subject? No, Cecil whispered. The first one who didn't come back right. He pointed to the floor, to a crooked trap door behind the sitting room rug. It's not just an attic. There's a basement beneath it. Father built it to store wine. Alaric used it to store thoughts. Thorne pried the trap door open. A wooden ladder descended into pitch blackness. The air below was unnaturally cold. Each step creaked like a groan from the house itself. As Thorne's boots touched the stone floor, the whispering returned, louder this time, but still impossible to localize. It wasn't around him. It was inside him. He passed empty glass jars lined with copper wiring and symbols etched in soot on the walls. A twisted desk in the corner held patient files, dozens of them, all bearing the same strange symptom. Subject reports external consciousness, states they can feel another mind blinking inside them. And then, Thorn saw him. In a chair bolted to the wall sat a man, thin, barely alive, skin like wax, eyes wide open. Not once did they flicker. He didn't flinch, didn't breathe, just watched. Cecil's voice echoed down the stairs. "That's Edward. He's been like that since 1906. They called it catatonia, but Alaric said he succeeded with him." "Succeeded?" Thorn asked, trembling. Cecil paused. "He made Edward forget how to own his thoughts. Now the thoughts own him." As Thorn leaned closer, Edward's lips twitched, and then, in a dry whisper that sounded like leaves scraping a window, "He's still inside me." The basement felt heavier now, as if the very air had grown a mind of its own. Thorn couldn't shake Edward's whisper from his ears. "He's still inside me." But who was he? Was it Alaric Vale, or something older? Thorn stepped around Edward carefully, drawn to a desk against the wall. Upon it sat a strange machine, a phonograph, but unlike any Thorn had seen. It had copper wiring twisted around its arm and a black wax cylinder already loaded. Next to it lay a brittle, blood-stained page with a crude map, not of places, but of a human brain. The regions were labeled in Vale's cryptic handwriting: resonant memory field, echo chamber of guilt, imposed narrative zone, false voice inlet. At the center was a circle labeled hollow. Thorn stared at it, shivering. He turned to the phonograph. A handwritten note was tucked beneath. Voice recording, subject 4, listen alone. He pressed play. At first, static, then breathing, then a woman's voice. Not scared, not crying, just wrong. "I woke up, and the thoughts weren't mine," the voice said. "I remember burying a doll in the garden, but I never owned a doll. I never had a garden." A pause. "I can feel him smiling when I speak. He's learning through me." The voice began to change mid-sentence, shifting pitch, accent, even gender. A man now, then a child, then back to the woman again, as if the tape contained multiple people inside a single vocal cord. And then, the worst part, the final voice was his own, Thorn's voice, saying words he never remembered speaking. "There is no mirror. There is only what looks back." He dropped the needle, heart racing. From the corner of the room, Edward's jaw began to open wider than seemed humanly possible. Thorn backed away from Edward, from his unnaturally gaping mouth, the hollow voice, and the phonograph still spinning without sound. He stumbled toward the corner of the room, breathing heavy, heart punching against his ribs. His foot caught on a floorboard that clicked, and then the wall behind the desk shifted. A narrow panel opened with a low, grinding groan, revealing a stone staircase spiraling downward into deeper darkness. Cecil appeared at the top of the basement steps, his face pale. "You weren't supposed to find that," he whispered. But he didn't stop Thorn. He just watched him descend. The walls here were damp, carved with symbols etched into lime and old blood. As Thorn's lantern flickered, he noticed surgical diagrams pinned to the walls, not on paper, but on thin sheets of stretched skin. The staircase ended in a large, circular room. At its center stood a crude operating table, stained with something black and crusted. Overhead, an ancient pulley system for gas lamps cast grotesque shadows. All around, medical cabinets held jars filled with gray fluid, each containing something organic: eyes, fingers, pieces of brain. But what truly stopped Thorn cold was the mirror. It stood at the far end of the room, framed in ornate iron shaped like grasping hands. It reflected the walls, the floor, the table, but not him. He stood in front of it. Nothing. No silhouette, no face. He waved, shouted. The room behind him responded. The mirror did not. Instead, in its black glass, another version of the room flickered, with a figure strapped to the table. The figure had Thorne's face, but its eyes were open wide and weeping blood. From behind him, Cecil's voice echoed softly. Alaric believed the soul is a lie. Only the narrative matters. If he could control the story in your mind, then he could write himself into it. Thorne stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the version of himself screaming silently from the other side of the mirror. He reached forward, but the glass felt cold, unyielding. Then he noticed something strange. His reflection slowly began to move, but not in sync with him. It smiled and blinked, while he stood still. On a shelf nearby sat a faded, leather-bound manuscript, its spine cracked with age. Across the front, in scorched letters, "The Mind Theatre, a Ritual of Narrative Occupation" by Dr. Alaric Vale. Thorne opened it cautiously. The pages inside were handwritten, illustrated with chilling diagrams of human skulls split open and puppet strings tied to the folds of the brain. The ritual required 3 things: a vessel with fractured identity, a candle that burns without fire, a mirror that sees thought instead of light. At the edge of the room, he noticed a small object glowing faintly. A candle made of bone, lit with no flame, no heat, only a soft green pulse. He lit nothing. It had always been burning. Thorne began to read from the manuscript aloud. To overwrite the self, one must silence its author, strip away memory, install a narrator. Suddenly, his mind shuddered, like a film reel being pulled from a projector mid-frame. Thoughts that had been clear now flickered. He couldn't remember what day it was, or what Cecil's last words had been, or why he even came here. But he could recite the last paragraph perfectly, in a voice that wasn't his. He gripped his head as a pressure bloomed behind his eyes, something hot and coiling. From behind him, the mirror now showed 2 Thorns, one panicked, one whispering. Cecil's voice echoed again, this time from inside his skull. Once the audience believes the actor, the old character dies quietly. Thorne staggered up from the ritual chamber, his legs trembling, heart hammering as if someone else was pumping it. He clutched the railing of the old staircase, but every step felt unfamiliar, like walking in borrowed shoes. He reached the main floor of the manor again, but something was off. The hallway wallpaper, once torn and peeling, now looked fresh. Victorian patterns in deep red. Gas lamps burned steadily on the walls. There were no cobwebs, no dust. It looked restored, yet he couldn't remember it ever being in disrepair. As he moved forward, the paintings along the walls caught his eye. Portraits of men in high collars and waistcoats. In the center of the corridor hung a new painting, larger than the rest. It was him, but older. Thorne with silver hair, eyes dark and knowing. He stood beside Dr. Alaric Vale, both of them holding the same manuscript, The Mind Theatre. He stepped back in disbelief. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, one he never lived. Alaric handing him a scalpel, smiling. "You see, Cecil, the subject must consent without knowing. That's where the art lies." "Cecil?" He shook his head. That wasn't his name, was it? The memory unfolded further, a dim theater, an audience watching as he stood center stage, dissecting a man's psyche word by word. The applause echoed in his ears. He touched his temple. "No, that's not me." But even as he denied it, his lips moved, speaking someone else's thought. The ego is a fiction, and fictions can be edited. His reflection in the hallway mirror smiled. He didn't. From the end of the hallway, he heard a woman crying softly, a familiar voice. "Cecil, why are you doing this?" He turned the corner. There stood his mother, or someone wearing her face, in an old rocking chair, knitting something that looked like a mask made of hair and wax. She looked up. "You've always belonged to the story." Thorne stepped into the room and stopped cold. It was his childhood bedroom. The wooden dresser with the carved initials, the lopsided shelf filled with broken toys, the cracked ceiling that once dripped during monsoons. It was all here. But that was impossible. His real home had burned down when he was 12. He remembered the smoke, the screams. Or had it? On the nightstand sat an old snow globe. Inside, a tiny porcelain boy stood alone beside a flickering lamppost. He picked it up, and as he shook it, the flakes inside swirled unnaturally, forming words on the glass. "Do you remember what never happened?" From the hallway, the woman's humming continued, a slow, sorrowful lullaby. Each note twisted the room around him, bending the walls, curling the corners of the ceiling like paper set near fire. A small boy's laughter rang out behind him. He turned and saw himself at age 8, sitting cross-legged on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. The child didn't look up. "What are you building?" Thorne asked. The boy paused, then spoke without facing him. "A new memory. One where you never leave. One where he always wins." "He?" The boy turned slowly. His eyes were completely black. His mouth didn't move, but Thorne heard the voice. "Alaric's story needs a loyal narrator." Thorne stumbled backward. The dresser drawers flung open by themselves, revealing dozens of identical notebooks, all filled with his handwriting. Except he hadn't written a single one. Each page began the same. Cecil Thorne reporting from inside the mind. Day 1, Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. They went on to Day 6 of 41. Suddenly, the lights went out. The lullaby stopped. And the child whispered one final line. "You were never real, Thorne. You were only ever written." Thorne yanked open the warped closet door in the child's room, hoping for escape, but finding only darkness and the scent of ink. Then, a click. A spiral staircase dropped from the ceiling like a hanging spine, creaking downward into dim, amber light. He descended. The air grew denser with each step, like walking into a lung filled with dust and memory. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a room that defied logic. The walls were made of paper, bound together with thread and human hair. Pens hovered mid-air, scribbling constantly. Shelves stretched endlessly, stacked with identical manuscripts, all titled The Mind Theatre, Volume, but none of them had a volume number. They simply read In Progress. In the center stood a long surgical table, but instead of tools it was lined with erasers, quills, red ink, and a typewriter dripping black oil. Suddenly, an unseen voice began reading from somewhere above, echoing softly. Thorne opened the door. He descended. He observed the impossible. His movements mirrored the narration, perfectly, involuntarily. Thorne reached for the nearest manuscript, and without choosing to, he did. The book was warm, breathing. Its spine pulsed like a vein. Inside, the pages were filled with his life, word for word, even this moment. He flipped to the final page. It was blank, except for one line. "Your ending will be written once you understand who you've always been." Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned. There stood a man with no face, only a mirror where his head should be. Thorne saw himself in it, flickering, confused, terrified. The faceless man gestured to the typewriter, and without a word, Thorne sat down. His fingers moved on their own. Click, clack, tap, tap. He was writing his own fate, line by line. But it wasn't his voice. It was Alaric's. From the ceiling, hundreds of other thodes, man-like figures hung suspended by strings, all trapped mid-sentence, like forgotten drafts. "You are not a man," the voice whispered. "You are a revision." Thorn's fingers ached. The keys clicked on their own. Words formed that he did not think. Paragraphs emerged that he could not stop. He lifted his hand, the manuscript read, but found it chained not to steel, but to narrative. He clenched his jaw and pushed away from the desk. "No," he growled. "I'm not just a character." But the moment he said it, the room pulsed, like something was displeased. The mirror-headed man watched silently from the shadows. No gesture, no breath. Thorn grabbed the manuscript and ripped it in half. The pages screamed. Ink bled from the torn spine like blood from a throat. The air convulsed, and the sound of ripping echoed in infinite distortion, as if reality itself had been split. Then everything went black. He awoke back in the child's bedroom. Same cracked walls, same dusty air, but something had changed. The wallpaper had writing now. His name, repeated in a spiral. Thorn, 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 Thorn. In the mirror, he didn't see his reflection. He saw Alaric, not in shadow, not blurred, full, smiling, watching him from within the glass. "You tore the page," Alaric whispered through the mirror, "but the story doesn't need permission." Suddenly, a sharp pain burst behind Thorn's eyes. He collapsed, clutching his head. Images invaded his mind. Children with stitched mouths, corridors made of teeth, memories that weren't his. And then, silence. When he stood again, the manuscript was whole, sitting on the bed, opened to the exact page he tore. But now the text had changed. The man tried to rewrite his fate. The system corrected the error. He flipped to the final page again. Another line had appeared. "Rebellions are footnotes. The story continues." Thorn's fingers ached. The keys clicked on their own. Words formed that he did not think. Paragraphs emerged that he could not stop. He lifted his hand, the manuscript read, but found it chained not to steel, but to narrative. He clenched his jaw and pushed away from the desk. "No," he growled. "I'm not just a character." But the moment he said it, the room pulsed, like something was displeased. The mirror-headed man watched silently from the shadows. No gesture, no breath. Thorn grabbed the manuscript and ripped it in half. The pages screamed. Ink bled from the torn spine like blood from a throat. The air convulsed, and the sound of ripping echoed in infinite distortion, as if reality itself had been split. Then everything went black. He awoke back in the child's bedroom. Same cracked walls, same dusty air, but something had changed. The wallpaper had writing now. His name, repeated in a spiral. Thorn, 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 Thorn. In the mirror, he didn't see his reflection. He saw Alaric, not in shadow, not blurred, full, smiling, watching him from within the glass. "You tore the page," Alaric whispered through the mirror, "but the story doesn't need permission." Suddenly, a sharp pain burst behind Thorn's eyes. He collapsed, clutching his head. Images invaded his mind. Children with stitched mouths, corridors made of teeth, memories that weren't his. And then, silence. When he stood again, the manuscript was whole, sitting on the bed, opened to the exact page he tore. But now the text had changed. The man tried to rewrite his fate. The system corrected the error. He flipped to the final page again. Another line had appeared. "Rebellions are footnotes. The story continues." The road back to the estate wasn't a path anymore. It was pages. Literally. Dozens of parchment sheets fluttered in the air like leaves, lining the dirt path that led Thorne back. Each one bore lines he didn't recall writing, yet they carried his handwriting. Some passages described actions he hadn't taken yet. Others described emotions he hadn't felt, until now. The villagers didn't chase him. They just watched, heads tilted at identical angles, lips sealed, eyes blank, as if awaiting the return of a wandering actor to the stage. He reached the estate gates. They swung open on their own. Inside, Dr. Alaric waited, not in his office, but on the front steps, holding a single sheet of paper and wearing a smile that was neither warm nor cruel. Just clinical. "You wrote this, didn't you?" he asked, tapping the page. Thorne shook his head. "I don't remember. I swear." "Not remembering doesn't mean it wasn't you," Alaric said calmly. "You've merely refused to turn the page." The sheet in Alaric's hand fluttered, then ignited. Ash danced upward like black snowflakes, landing on Thorne's coat. And then he saw it. The large mirror in the entrance hall, cracked like before, now showed a different version of Thorne. Not scared, not angry. This Thorne was writing. Calmly, mechanically, and behind him in the reflection stood Alaric, whispering into his ear, guiding his hand. "This is the part," Alaric said behind him, "where you write why you came here in the first place." "I came to expose you." "No," Alaric whispered, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You came because you needed me to give shape to your guilt." Thorne's hands trembled. He looked down. A pen was already in them. The study door creaked open by itself. Inside, the desk was prepared. Blank pages. Waiting. Thorne sat before the heavy oak desk, the pen gripped in his hand like a lifeline or a weapon. The parchment in front of him stared back blankly, unnerving in its silence. Outside the window, fog coiled through the estate grounds like smoke from an invisible fire. He didn't remember sitting or picking up the pen, but here he was. He began to write. "I arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. The wind was different that day, like it was whispering something I couldn't quite hear." The sentence wasn't his, but it felt right. More followed, smooth and rhythmic, as if someone else had pre-written it inside his bones. The ink flowed too easily, and his hand never paused to think. Thorne tried to stop. His fingers wouldn't listen. Each line described events from the week, but changed, distorted. He hadn't eaten lamb stew. The page said he had. He hadn't heard singing in the halls, but now, faintly, he did. Dr. Alaric showed me the theater of memory. We are not performers in life. We are rewritten drafts, again and again, until the author is satisfied. Suddenly, a drop of something wet hit the page. Blood. It dripped from his nose. Or had it come from the ceiling? The ink began to swirl, letters shifting. Words rearranged themselves into new meanings, and in that moment, the pages flipped forward like wind-blown leaves, revealing future entries, entries signed with his name, describing events that hadn't happened yet. His funeral. Alaric giving the eulogy. Villagers nodding solemnly. A sealed journal buried beneath a sycamore tree. He stood sharply, knocking over the ink pot. The black pool spread, but didn't soak into the paper. It formed a perfect circle. A mirror. His reflection blinked back. But it wasn't his eyes anymore. It was Alaric's. The estate was no longer just a house. Thorne noticed it first in the hallway, a whisper of wind brushing his ear before he even moved. As he thought of the study, the door at the end creaked open, not with force, but with welcome. It knew. He tested it again. Dining room, he thought. Down the corridor, a chandelier flickered above that very doorway, as if nodding. Thorne stood frozen. Not out of fear, but disbelief. He was being obeyed, not by people, but by the structure itself. Yet what terrified him wasn't obedience. It was understanding. Every creak, every shadow stretching along the walls, every flicker of gaslight had meaning. Not random, not atmospheric, but intentional. He entered the drawing room. The fireplace roared to life without a match. Flames danced in perfect silence. And then, voices. Not loud, not screaming, but delicate, like silk brushing against parchment. "You dream too loudly, Inspector." He spun. No one. "That's why we hear you." His breath caught in his throat. Paintings on the wall seemed to breathe with him. A woman in one oil portrait looked down, her mouth parted as if ready to speak. Her eyes shimmered, moist. He stepped back, and the floor gave slightly, not like wood bending, but like flesh shifting under pressure. The voice again. "Memory is a room you cannot lock, Thorne. You only think you live outside it." Suddenly he realized he hadn't spoken in hours, yet everything had still responded. The house was speaking through him, for him, around him. But it wanted more. He touched the wall beside him. It pulsed beneath his fingers. A heartbeat. Not his. The heartbeat in the wall wasn't a metaphor. It was real. Thorne followed the rhythm down the corridor, past rooms now eerily still, like they were holding their breath. A subtle thump. Thump. Guided his feet, not fast, not urgent, but deliberate. It led to a door hidden behind a long velvet curtain. The moment he touched the handle, it burned cold. The door groaned open with a sound like breath after drowning, and a damp, musky wind kissed his face. Stone steps spiraled downward, slick with moss, into the estate's buried basement. This level had no floor plans, not in the town's archives, not even in the builder's ledgers. It shouldn't exist. Yet here it was. The walls were flesh-toned, veined. They twitched when he passed. As he descended, the heartbeat grew louder, faster. Then the room opened. It wasn't a basement, it was a chamber, massive, cathedral-like, carved from wet rock and bone. And in the center, an iron cradle. Not a crib for an infant, no. This was man-sized, suspended by chains above a black pool that smelled of rust and regret. Within the cradle, something wrapped in old medical gauze, blackened with age and seeping. Thorne took one step closer. The cradle rocked. And then, from behind, a voice, low and almost fatherly. "He wakes when truth arrives." Thorne turned sharply. Dr. Elric stood at the edge of the chamber. His eyes glowed faintly in the low light. He wore no coat, no gloves, only a grin. "You brought the final key, Inspector," he whispered. "Your mind, your guilt, your history." The creature in the cradle stirred. One long, bone-thin hand slipped through the gauze, and it pointed at Thorne. Elric stepped closer, his boots echoing softly on the damp floor of the chamber. Behind him, the iron cradle swayed gently, the gauze-wrapped figure within letting out a faint coo, like a dreaming infant, but darker, knowing. Thorne raised his pistol. "What is that?" Elric smiled, calm as ever. "That, dear Inspector, is your shadow." The gun trembled in Thorne's hand. "You think you came to investigate me, to uncover some cult or secret project, but you've had it wrong from the beginning." Elric began to circle the cradle, his voice weaving through the cavern like smoke. "Do you remember your first breakdown back in '81? The insomnia, the visions, the blackouts? You told your superiors it was stress, but it wasn't. That was the first time your mind slipped into the boundary." Thorne's memories surged. The blood on his hands, the distorted dreams, the 3 days that vanished from his life. "We found you then," Elric said, pausing beside the cradle. And we watched. You were perfect. You see, this isn't about power. It's about memory. Thorn's mouth went dry. Memory. Yes. We aren't shaping people through chemicals or torture, no. We extract memory from trauma, the raw kind, the kind that shapes the soul. And when we feed it to him, he gestured to the cradle. He grows, becomes wiser, and more real. The cradle rocked harder, the hand now fully outstretched, nails like ink-dipped needles. Elric looked up, eyes glowing. You, Inspector, are his final meal, the last truth. Thorn stepped back, but the chamber pulsed. The walls began to breathe. Suddenly, images flooded his mind, not his own. Childhoods torn apart, lives ruined, crimes unsolved. Hundreds, thousands. You've carried their memories for years, Thorn, Elric whispered. That's why you feel heavy when you walk, why you can't sleep. You are a walking vault. And now the vault was about to be opened. The air turned thick, not with heat, but with memory. Thorn could feel it, like humidity made of regret. His skin prickled as the cradle let out a low, rattling breath. The gauze around the figure inside began to unravel on its own, curling away like burned parchment. Don't, Thorn growled, stepping forward, his revolver aimed again. Wrap it back, now. Elric didn't even flinch. You don't command truth, Inspector. You only delay it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, coiled from the cradle and reached Thorn's ears. You let her die. Thorn froze. The girl, 7 years old. You saw the signs, but you were too tired. You closed the file and poured another drink. No, he gasped. No one ever knew that. Elric tilted his head, studying Thorn like a proud teacher watching a student crack under pressure. He knows everything you buried, Thorn, and now he's giving it back. The gauze continued to unfurl. A face began to show, not fully human, childlike in shape, yet ancient in texture. Its eyes were closed, stitched shut, its mouth sewn into a grin, and yet it spoke, inside his mind. The orphan boy. You promised to help. Then you got promoted and left. He hanged himself 3 weeks later. Thorn clutched his head. The revolver fell from his hand with a clang. His knees buckled. The memories were not just returning. They were alive, sharper, louder, as though he were being forced to live them again, frame by agonizing frame. Elric stood beside the cradle, arms open like a priest at a baptism. This isn't punishment, he said softly. It's a restoration. The stitched mouth on the childlike face smiled wider now. You are next. Suddenly the cradle stopped rocking, and then the stitched eyes began to twitch, tugging at their seams. The seams split. With a soft, wet snap, the stitched eyes of the cradle's occupant tore open. Not blood, but something far stranger, trickled out like ink diluted in water. And from those eyes, Thorn saw himself. But it wasn't just his face. It was versions of him. In one flickering image, he was laughing, glass in hand, ignoring a phone that never stopped ringing. In another, he was sobbing, kneeling in an alley beside a body he didn't save. And in yet another, he was smiling eerily, in a room without windows, whispering secrets to a faceless patient. Make it stop, Thorn begged. His voice cracked. Make it stop, Elric. But Elric only watched with calm devotion. Why would you stop a mirror from reflecting what it sees? He replied. This isn't madness, Thorn. This is clarity. The cradle no longer held a body. It was now a pool, deep, black, and endless. Thorn was no longer standing in the room. He was floating, disembodied, watching his own past play out in impossible directions. Every lie, every failure, every moral compromise. His father, his estranged daughter, his silence when others needed him to speak. All of it, replayed, overlaid, multiplied. And through it all, the childlike voice whispered, "All stories come back to the beginning. All beginnings are betrayals." Suddenly, Thorne's body jerked. His eyes rolled back, and from his mouth came laughter. But it wasn't his. Elric stepped forward and placed a hand on Thorne's shoulder. "Welcome," he said gently, "to your truest self." The room snapped back into focus. The cradle was gone, but Thorne remained seated on the floor, silent, smiling. The floor beneath the cradle shifted. A faint mechanical click echoed, followed by a slow, grinding sound. Part of the stone cracked open like a secret jaw, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness. Without a word, Elric motioned forward. Thorne, still shaken, his face stiff with a faint, unearned smile, began walking down. Torch-like lights flickered on as he moved, but they gave off no heat, only an unnatural white glow. The air smelled sterile, metallic, and something else. Old ink, burned parchment, and something that remembered screams. At the bottom was a circular chamber, stone walls, bookshelves lining the room like ribs in a chest cavity, and in the center stood a podium. On it rested the ledger, bound in human leather, stained with finger-smudged ink, pages crinkled, some still damp. A strange red seal glowed on its cover, pulsing like a heartbeat. Thorne moved toward it, not of his own will, but as if pulled by gravity. Elric's voice was soft now, reverent. "Every broken mind leaves behind residue, guilt, secrets, patterns. I learned to harvest them. This ledger, it contains the confessions of the unwilling, stories never spoken aloud, not to priests, not to lovers, not even to their own thoughts." Thorne opened the first page. His hands trembled. There was his name, and underneath it, dates, events, moments he had never shared with another living soul. "How?" he whispered. "Because truth doesn't hide," Elric replied. "It just waits." Behind Thorne, movement. Figures emerged from the shadows, 6 of them, eyes wide, mouths stitched shut, dressed in faded inspector uniforms. One stepped forward. A woman. Her name tag barely legible. Det. Yara Mendez. She vanished 10 years ago. Case cold. Never found. "They read the ledger," Elric said. "They understood." Thorne looked up. His smile was gone now. "What do you want from me?" Elric's eyes gleamed. "To write your truth. In full." Thorne's fingers hovered above the open ledger, but he wasn't turning the pages anymore. They were flipping on their own. Each rustle echoed like a scream in the cold chamber. The words were appearing. Ink bled up from beneath the parchment as though the pages themselves were feeding on his thoughts. Every memory, every buried sin was surfacing. Childhood fears, brutal interrogations. The moment he let an innocent man take the fall for political convenience. His breathing quickened. No, I never told anyone this," he whispered. Elric stood a few feet away, serene, watchful, his fingers clasped behind his back like a proud teacher observing a promising student. "You don't need to tell, Inspector. You only need to remember. The ledger listens, and then it decides." On one page, Thorne saw a drawing of himself, but not the version he saw in mirrors. This Thorne had hollowed eyes, a stretched smile, and a long crimson thread sewn along his wrist, just like the stitched-mouthed figures in the room. He recoiled, but the book kept writing. A voice, not his own, echoed in his mind. You were never the observer. You were always the subject. Suddenly, the room pulsed. The walls rippled like breathing flesh. The other inspectors slowly raised their heads toward Thorne, their eyes gleaming with a shared recognition. They weren't victims. They were initiates. Elric stepped forward and pressed a hand gently on Thorne's shoulder. You see, Inspector, guilt is not something to cure. It's something to preserve, to catalog. And when curated correctly, it makes the perfect vessel. The book's last page opened, blank. The inkwell on the podium tipped over by itself, a thick black liquid spreading like oil. Thorne's hand twitched. Then, as if on cue, he began to write. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the wooden beams of the ancient chamber. Thorne sat motionless at the podium now, pen in hand, head bowed low. The once defiant inspector had vanished. In his place sat something quieter, emptier. The final page of the ledger was no longer blank. It was filled with tight, looping script, too neat, too controlled, as if written by someone not human at all. Outside, the village of Greymire was silent. Dr. Elric moved to the doorway, adjusting his coat with quiet satisfaction. Behind him, the chorus of stitched inspectors returned to their stations, upright, unmoving, eyes forward. Their work was complete. Every mind bends, Elric whispered, but only the strongest can shatter into clarity. He turned back once, and what he saw confirmed it. Thorne, or whatever remained of him, was smiling. Not a grin of madness, not relief, but a smile of understanding, of belonging. His eyes were vacant, yet fixated. He had become the new ledger keeper, the soul curator, the chronicler of guilt. He began to whisper, voice hollow yet steady. The village remembers. The guilt is sacred, and I am its witness. A soft knock came from the distant wooden door. Another visitor, another case, another story. Elric nodded and disappeared into the corridor's shadow, leaving Thorne to greet the next with a smile stitched into memory. Do you believe every sin deserves to be forgotten, or does some guilt write itself into the world, waiting for someone to read it again?